Welcome to today's special episode of Screenshot podcast series from the Inspiration Forum. You are about to hear an artist talk by a Filipina visual artist and filmmaker Kiri Dalena, who spoke with an art theorist and journalist Anna Remešová about her activist work that deals with the current and past representations of political violence in the Philippines.
I'm very happy to be here. I prepared 6 works made largely from 2016 to the present. They are mostly short films, and one is work which is part of my collective, but the others are short films presented variously as also installations in the Philippines.
So the first movies that you are going to see is Christmas in Our Hearts, Reloaded, and Aluncina. And maybe can you just say a few words about these 2 works?
Yes, Christmas in Our Hearts is actually a videoke. It's the work that I included, which is made by my collective, which I'll talk about later on. It was shown online. The platform that we specifically thought about this is online. So perhaps I can talk more about it after you see it.
Bukas ay babangon din ang silangan mo'y pupula sa tinyas ng paglaya.
We can continue with the image on, and because both of the videos tackle or were created in a very specific historical context, even in very different form they react to it, I would like to first ask you about what was the original context of 2016 and what were the consequences of the so-called war on drugs that the president Rodrigo Duterte started when he became president in 2016.
So these 2 films, the context is they were done within the period of the former President Rodrigo Duterte, who was elected president in 2016. He broke many stereotypes in the sense that he was very popular. He did not come from traditional political family and styled himself, in fact, declared himself as the first socialist Filipino president. And his campaign promises included raising salaries, ending very short-term work contracts in the Philippines, as well as putting an end to criminality by means of which he attributed to the proliferation of the use of drugs in the Philippines. So this was a central program in his campaign, the war on drugs, which he really used to rally Filipinos to believe that, okay, if we eradicate drugs, then criminality will end and it will be a better country. So this, of course, he won by an overwhelming margin in the elections. And from June 30th, 2016, that was when the killings really did begin. It was unprecedented in the sense that every night there would be bodies of drug personalities, identified drug personalities, and they were overwhelmingly from the poor, that they would be killed either in police operations. It would be said that they fought back, and that's why they were neutralized. But one feature of the war on drugs was really instilling fear by killing drug personalities and dumping their bodies in public places with cardboard signages, which would say, "I'm a drug pusher, don't be like me. And that's like the reference for the first video that you saw, because it became a nightly nightmare. The journalists who also covered the night beat in the previous administration said that the number of the victims, they've never had this experience, from 23 dead bodies within the city and showing various forms of torture and rap. So this scenario happened in 2016.
And both of the videos react on this situation. The first one that we saw with the cardboards and this Christmas song was part of more like an activist campaign that was launched by this collective Resback. Can you maybe, because you are a member of this group, can you talk a little bit about what the group is doing and what was this campaign about?
When I was introduced, it was said that I work as an individual and as part of collectives. So Resback is a slang term in my country, meaning like fight back or retaliate. And in 2016, what caused us a great anxiety was we felt that the war on drugs, or this method that was used, was tolerated because people kept silent and even applauded what was happening. So we banded together, mostly filmmakers, and decided to create this collective. And what we did was produce these short films, which were more for the internet, for social media, so Facebook, YouTube. And I remember that the text said it was 2,000, the number was 2,000 killed. Today, the estimate is the police admits over 6,000 killed in police operations, but independent human rights groups estimate as high as 27,000 to 30,000 individuals killed. When we produced this video and put it out on Facebook and YouTube, what I remember was the relief when people started to post comments that they agreed with us. They were happy that someone was speaking out. It gave us encouragement that we were not as few as we thought we were. So that's the context of the video. And the video takes off from a very popular Christmas song in the Philippines. If you say Christmas in our hearts, it's always played when September or the Burr months start. So we used it as a way to also appeal to a more popular audience. And videos are also very popular in the Philippines. So we had these strategies of, the films.
The second film that we saw a short excerpt from it is called Alonsina. And my question is, because this is more traditional, is also very experimental because you use the kids' illustration in it, but it is more like traditional documentary movie about the consequences of the drug war, the war on drugs, and the situation of one concrete family. Is it important for you to divide your work for activist groups and, for example, like film industry or art scene? Is it important to divide between these two fields?
No, not necessarily. But I would say that when I co-founded the collective, for example, a lot of the work that we've done is organizing, also gathering families. It did not necessarily produce as well productions. And Alonsina, as a context, was produced through the support of the Berlin Biennale. Like in 2020, they invited me, and then they said that, what would you like to do that you haven't been able to do? So just do it. And then I realized that in the last 4 years, since 2016, I haven't really done, even if I was very much engaged in the theme of the war on drugs, I've never done a documentary on my own about the subject. So I said that I've known this family. The family, you saw the grandmother, she's 86 years old. She took on the responsibility of caring for 7 children after their father was executed in a police operation in front of the children, and the mother was imprisoned also for drugs. But I'd say that maybe to give it context, I chose this particular scene because I asked permission. I've known them 4 years at that time. I asked permission to document, and I stayed for a night. And then when the grandmother was putting the children to sleep, the song that she sang was not a conventional lullaby, but a protest song. And the protest song was sang as a lullaby. So I was really surprised, but as well as encouraged that, okay, in fact, that protest song traces back to the time of the American colonizers, and it was sang as a lullaby. So I thought it was important to show that it was history, or even protest was being taught in this manner. So, did I answer the question? Oh, yeah.
Perfectly. Thank you very much. Do you want to add something more to these movies, or shall we?
Yes. So, I was invited by the Berlin Biennale to make a documentary, but I ended up not being able to finish the shoot because COVID came. And that's why the documentary is interspersed with animation. The children were drawing, so I gathered existing drawings and animated them. But the upturned video, it started as an accident. Like, we do not really have access to the proper gimbal, so we had to put the camera upside down. But then I realized I like this because there's something troubling about documenting a very difficult situation and, watching it comfortably. So I thought that, okay, keep it upside down. And at the same time, it was during the pandemic where everything was really just so conflated. I mean, the problems of these families and then the pandemic. So I thought that it conveyed what I thought about the world being really upside down. What was right was wrong.
Yeah, I can imagine, because there are some parts of these movies which are very strong and emotional, because the kids are explaining what they are drawing about and they are crying about it. And maybe that was also my question, like if you ask them to draw the situation because it was very heavy or difficult for them to talk about it, or they draw it and then you...
No, they were already existing, the drawings, except for the part of the hands. I particularly bonded with them because they love to draw. And I saw that the drawings existed. They were drawings about what transpired. So all of these drawings were not like, I asked them, can you draw what happened? But they existed. And I think it's also important to note that since the danger, the potential of harm was still there, I excluded the children who were witnesses to what happened. So, as well as the mother. By the time that I was shooting it, the mother was already freed from prison. Like, she had to admit guilt to be freed. So I did not include the mother as well in the documentary, as well as the older children who were witnesses to the killing.
Thank you very much. Now we skip to the two other films, which are called Requiem for M and From the Dark Depths, that will get us to earlier times, more like 2000, early 2000s. Do you want to say a few words about the context?
Requiem for M is the only film that doesn't fall within the period of Rodrigo Duterte. It was shot in 2010, but I decided to include it because it was from an incident that took place during the elections, and perhaps to also introduce the way I sort of convey documentary in a different manner.
Tama na yun! Ang dami na nilang pinatay! Ang dami na! Tama na yun! Tama na yun! Maraming taong nasaktan! Yung mga pamilya na iwan ng biktima! Alam ba nila kung ano nararamdaman namin ngayon?
The second movie goes back maybe to your beginning as a filmmaker. Can you talk a little about your motivation, why you started to film and how you became filmmaker?
Okay, so the second work, From the Dark Depths, the title is taken from a poem that was written by the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines, Jose Maria Sison. So the Philippines has one of the longest running communist insurgencies in the world. It's Marxist, Maoist, Leninist. It was founded in 1968. And in 2016, as much as I talked about the policy of the war on drugs in the Philippines, I also mentioned that the president styled himself as the first socialist president. So he had this appearance of being, he resumed the peace negotiations with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, which represents the Communist Party of the Philippines, as well as its armed wing, the New People's Army. So there was this period of freeing political prisoners who were revolutionaries, and the talks continued. So there appeared to be a space to be able to start to talk about the communist movement. So I decided to also start, perhaps it was a time to also create stories about sort of my exposure as well to the underground movement, because I became an activist when I was in the university, embracing the principle of serving the people. And it was outside of Manila. I was a student outside of Manila, and eventually I did have this exposure to the underground movement, which was very beautiful, but at the same time very painful in terms of the losses. So I thought that, okay, I can make a film now, and went back to that underwater film scene is juxtaposed with archival documentary footage, which I also shot starting from 16 millimeter until it transitioned to analog and digital. So it was the beginning of touching base with archive. Of course, it was short-lived. The peace negotiations collapsed. But I think the tentativeness also surfaced in that film, in the sense that I was, in a way, still speaking in riddles, like the metaphors of going underwater, where we planted about 30 red flags underwater, but it's a longer documentary. So that is the context.
And what did this freeing during the first or the beginning of the President Duterte, what did it mean for the filmmaking and for the censorship?
It was polarizing in the sense that he appeared to be good to leftists or activists, but at the same time was killing the poor, or those that were framed as the non, sort of the dregs of society. So there was this situation where he was lauded for resuming a very important, the peace negotiations, which could possibly end the war or give resolution to fundamental problems in the Philippines, but then at the same time was neutralizing thousands of the poor Filipinos.
And what happened when the peace talks collapsed between the government and the president and the Communist Party? Did they go back to village?
Yes, when the peace negotiations collapsed, they started to run after the activists as well as the same political prisoners that they freed, and the attacks expanded. I believe that many activists already expected this, but it was also necessary to take advantage of the peace negotiations to push for the freedom of the political prisoners. But he eventually called for the declaration or the tagging of the Communist Party of the Philippines as terrorists. Yeah, so that was what happened.
And maybe regarding the first movie that we see and that was filmed backwards, the Requiem for M, can you explain a little bit the historical context of it?
Okay, Requiem for M. So I also work as a documentary filmmaker for, let's say, Human Rights Watch. But at that time, in 2010, I was working with a journalist who was producing documentaries for television. And one of the incidents that we covered was a massacre in the Philippines. It took place in November of 2009. It's called the Maguindanao or the Ampatuan Massacre, where 58 persons were killed in an election-related incident of violence. 34 of those who were killed were journalists. And perhaps I should explain that elections, especially the national elections in the Philippines, is always a very critical or a violent time, because politicians or political dynasties would try to hold on to power. And in the case of the Maguindanao massacre, the incumbent governor was suddenly being challenged. Their family was challenged by a new political candidate. And those who were killed were on their way to file for the candidacy of this opposition candidate. It was a convoy of 6 cars, including 2 vehicles which were not even part of that convoy. They were blocked by over 100 armed men, members of the police force, as well as members of the private army of the politician. The private armies were allowed to flourish. And they were taken to a dirt road, to a remote area, a hill, where they were killed in one blow, 58 persons. And the level of planning for this was unbelievable. There was a backhoe that was already there waiting that had dug graves, like huge graves in the ground, not just for the people, but also for the vehicles. So they dumped the bodies as well as the vehicles. The fact that they thought that they could get away with this happened in broad daylight, was so brazen. Yeah, so I did cover the aftermath, and we produced 2 documentaries for TV. But this short film, Requiem for M, I made after I was given a chance to just make a film. I was told I would be free to give it the form that I wanted. And what I did was I returned to the footage, and instead of going what, who, where, and why, I just decided to convey what I felt, and many of us felt at that moment. And I thought that it was this disgust over a situation where I remember when we were there walking towards the crime scene, when it was finally open to the families, and I was walking behind 70-year-old parents of one of the victims, and I just kept thinking that we shouldn't be in this situation. So I just decided to try to convey this idea of wanting to take away our people from this situation by literally rewinding or taking them away from the site of the killings.
That also leads me to the question how you screen your movies, like in which context. For example, if it is more in context of some, I don't know, galleries or community spaces, and then how you think about the relationship with the viewers, if it is like a starting point to start to talk about it, to share some emotions together, or how you think about this?
Yeah, I'm quite broad, meaning I don't choose. Like Requiem for M was shown on national TV, which I thought was great. They decided to have this, because of independent producers, they created this space for short filmmakers to make films that conveyed our vision about the country. And what I remember was when I showed this film for TV, I remembered receiving messages like from strangers that they said that, because of course the scenes are very familiar to Filipinos. It's been replayed on news, but then when they saw it presented that way, they just told me that, thank you for the film. I did not really understand it, but I felt it, and it was strange. So there, it was shown on TV.
And the second one, From the Dark Depths?
From the Dark Depths is, I would say, the first film that I made which had funding. It's not a lot, about 100,000 pesos. How do I convert that?
40,000 crowns.
It's small, right? But I usually hesitate applying for grants in the Philippines because there are grant-giving bodies in the Philippines, but then they own the rights. So I hesitate to do that. But then there was a festival named Q Cinema, which said that we would have 100% of the rights. So that was my first time to apply. Yeah, so it was shown in a short, I think a week-long festival in the Philippines. There.
Now we are going to see 2 more videos. One is Erased Slogans. You will recognize it according to what you will see. Erased slogans is a very literal definition of the movie. And the second one is Pila. In Filipino, it means queue, the queue. So, Q, maybe some of you remember this work if you visited Documenta in Kassel this year. This work that you see right now, Pila, is from this year, and it was exhibited there in the Hübner Areal, right in the back. And it was actually like a huge installation, like a more than human scale installation. Can you maybe first, before we get to the installation, can you talk a little how you were invited by the curatorial collective Ruang Grupa from Indonesia that curated this year's art show Documenta in Kassel? You maybe know this show. It happens every 5th year in Kassel. It's like a huge event in the international art scene. And can you maybe talk a little about your invitation and your work, how you were invited?
The artistic direction of the Documenta 15 was given to Ruang Rupa, an Indonesian collective, and I am familiar with them because I also showed some films in the Jakarta Biennale years ago, and that's how I first worked with them. So I just remember that they invited me to talk. It was during the middle of the pandemic, so I know that they were doing a lot of interviews and research. And yes, I talked to them and didn't hear from them again until I received a message that I was invited. The message was conveyed in 2021. Yeah, I believe so. This was the work that happened. They asked me for a provisional proposal, but at that time, the Philippines was under a very harsh lockdown. It was very difficult. People 60 years and above and 18 years and below are not allowed to go out, and we only have one person who could go out for the essentials. And it reached a point when it became so difficult, they were not giving the subsidies, or the rations was not enough, and people we knew were really starving. And then in April of 2021, a young woman, an artist, a graduate of the College of Fine Arts, brought out a table in the street, in one of the streets in our village, and put food there, and just a sign that says, "Give what you are able to give and take only what you need." And then that was when a movement started, when people started to bring out tables. Like in my case, I also brought out a table in our street and put food. Started with a few eggs, canned goods, and rice, and then people started to also bring food, and it just mushroomed all over the Philippines. So we called it community pantries. But the result is the government, instead of lauding this, accused the community pantry of being the work of communists because it referenced Marx, and really attacked the organizers. I think it also exposed the nature of the government to the masses, because they all were very happy that this initiative happened and couldn't understand why is this being attacked. And then the government also started to bring out like, oh, our military has been doing this for many years. But that was what happened with the community pantry. But then the scene in what you saw is in front of my house. And when Documenta invited me, I said, I was imagining maybe I could make a film about Marcos, but then it was impossible. We were not allowed to leave. So I said that perhaps I can shoot the pantry. And that was when I proposed it. But then again, even if I was part of those who were organizing it, we could not really go close to the people and film. So we also had to wait for the time when it was already possible to go near. This is actually a time when it was far better. Before this, we were all wearing face shields over our masks, and we were not allowed to talk at all. But until the very end, I was telling Documenta, I'm not sure if I can produce the work because I'm not even allowed to shoot the front of my house. But then it became possible, and what happens is it's a very noisy street. Me as an organizer, I could not hear the people, I just see them. And that was when I said that, can I put microphones? And if I put microphones, can you be as you are? I will be recording the video. What you say will be amplified. Talk about what you usually talk about, or talk about what you want us to hear, or just sleep. So that was the permission. And then the experience became all so different. Like some would become so encouraged to talk, like wall to wall. Others would just sleep. Yeah, so that's The first one.
One of the topics they also talk is about the new presidential election that won Bongbong Marcos. And that was this year. Can you talk a little bit like how the situation changed now with the new president? Because he's the son of the dictator. That when you saw the first video called Erase Slogans, that these were the protests against the dictator.
Ferdinand, the father of the current president. The erase slogans are photographs from the 1970s, just before martial law was declared in our country in 1972. So these are the protest actions that preceded it. And it was in 2008 when I saw these photojournalistic images, and then at the same time was alarmed by how the family of the Marcoses were inching their way to power. At that time, they were already in the Senate. And that was when I started to create this series, to convey this forgetting. In 2016, Bongbong Marcos, the son of the late dictator, ran for vice president, but he lost and continued. And then in 2022, that was when he finally filed for candidacy in the president to become the president and aligned himself with the family of Rodrigo Duterte. So they ran in tandem, the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte as vice president and the son of Marcos as the president. So they won. So the situation is, it's a partnership of convenience to protect each other. Rodrigo Duterte now faces criminal charges, like crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court. And once he stops being the president, of course, he loses his immunity. Duterte also withdrew the Philippines' membership to the International Criminal Court, so to sort of prevent this conviction. And they have prevented the investigators to come to the Philippines. And Bongbong Marcos is upholding that decision to not allow investigations to happen in the Philippines.
Do you want to add something more to the videos that we saw?
Yes, perhaps the line for me, or that video, was also very enlightening for us. The Philippines it's the social classes, it's very different. Like, I'm from the middle class, and then just across the street, you have people from the urban poor. And I think that it was necessary for me to, because of the recordings, because they allowed us to listen. And I think intentionally you were speaking so that we would hear. It wasn't us, because when the results of the elections came, a lot of the people from the middle class expressed disgust or anger at the masses for voting for Marcos. But then I think the video allowed me to understand further, like for the elections, for the people, it's not really a chance to vote someone who will really serve them for 6 years, but the elections for them is an opportunity to be able to be paid for their vote. So it was very specific in the video that they were talking about how much they were being paid by the politicians, as well as the food, chicken, after 2 years of really little food and no money, and then suddenly the politicians would pour out the money. So this was the context that we were working against.
So are there any questions?
Thank you very much for your work. I admire how brave you are to be an activist in such a political situation. And I would like to ask for the photos, erased slogans. I was curious about density of slogans that people are holding in the hands. And I remember some photos maybe from the similar time from Beijing, where also so many people were holding transparents and posters with the written slogans in the hand. So I wanted to ask if it was almost everyone was holding something. So I wanted to ask for that, if this is like a common way of the protest, that everyone is writing something and holding in the hands, or it was some specific way of protest. Because if I compare with local situation, if we demonstrate and we protest, it looked so intensive that everyone is taking something and write some slogan and go to the streets. So this is, if you can say a few words about this.
I hope I understood. So you're asking if it is a common practice in protests for each demonstrator to have placard. Yes, in the Philippines it is, and it continues to this day. During this time, many of the slogans were still in English, and they were very unique. In fact, it was some point it became painful for me to delete. It was over 100 photographs, so I did collect them in a red book. So it is there. Yes, I hope I answered that. Yeah, we do always have placards and slogans. And normally in the past, it would just be as common, like someone would write it down. But recently, I noticed that during my generation, it's always included as well, like who wrote it, like what organization. In the 70s, they were more spontaneous.
Is there more questions? Yeah, there.
Did you have some problem because of your work?
Yes, in the past, I had another collective, and we document human rights violations. Not all of our documentation get turned into short films, but serve a different purpose for human rights groups, organizations. And in one instance, when there were so many reports outside of Manila of cases, my boyfriend was abducted by the military while in the field. 2 of his companions were killed, but he was freed. So that was one very difficult time. We did file a case against this military. He was still a colonel at that time in that island. And we filed a case against him, but it was dismissed. This was in 2003. But then he went on to become a general and was even lauded by the president. And he went on to lead like 2 students. They were eventually killed in another area, which was also attributed to him. And he was finally convicted in 2018. So it took that long. I currently have a criminal case. I will find out the verdict in January. But in 2019, because I'm a filmmaker as well as an activist, I'm an officer in a human rights organization. I don't know why they elected me, but we have a human rights organization in the Philippines named Karapatan, and I'm an officer, and we filed for a writ of amparo and habeas data to protect human rights defenders. Our complaint was dismissed, our petition was dismissed, and what the government did to retaliate is they looked for loopholes in the paperwork and said that like there's a registration, like it's not updated, and used it as a basis that for the last 3 years, we have these hearings about the paperwork. So these are new forms of attacks.
Okay, any more questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you for being here and for talking to us. I have a question about the journalist situation in the Philippines. As you mentioned that you co-worked with journalists. I'm a journalist myself, and from what I know, the situation is quite dire right now. Like, I mean, not just the freedom of speech, but also a lot of attacks on journalists, a lot of incidents of violence and even killings. So can you tell us more about that? Maybe does somebody in your co-workers or your colleagues, do you know anybody personally who was attacked or targeted because of their journalist work? Thank you.
The attacks against journalists, the most famous one is with Maria Ressa, who is with a platform called Rappler. But a lot of the independent or alternative media organizations are also being attacked. Their websites are targeted. In the past, it was like I forget the term, but it's sort of like continuous, like they tried to bring it down, and then it was investigated. I remember it was a European organization that helped to trace where the attacks are coming from, and they did trace it to the government. And recently, some of these websites were also taken down, and the journalists had to push back for it to be restored. There are killings as well. The most prominent, the recent one, is of a radio broadcaster who was critical of Marcos and Duterte, and he was assassinated. He was shot inside his car. So there are attacks, and the journalists really do come together and try to push back. But like what happened to Percy Lapid, that was the journalist who was killed. The government or the police said they investigated and traced the shooter. They presented someone who said that he confessed to be the shooter, and the shooter said that the order came from someone who was in the prison. And then the person in prison that he pointed to suddenly was killed. I know it's bizarre, but you have this sort of way so that they could not trace who was the mastermind behind these killings, but also would like to say, oh, we did something and we can't go beyond the investigation.
Thank you very much.
That's all for today. Kiri Dalena was a guest of the Inspiration Forum at the 26th Ji.hlava International Documentary Film Festival. In our next special, you will hear members of artistic collective Total Refusal talk about their art based mostly on subversive ways of gaming. They also discuss how politics permeate video games and how this entertainment medium reflects our late capitalist realities. You can listen to all screenshot episodes at inspirationforum.com/podcasts and in all podcast hosting apps.